Good morning. So let me start by introducing myself, since this is the first lecture in our series based on the Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review Project, LACIR. And my name is Nora Lustig. I am the Samuel Z. Stone Professor of Latin American Economics at Tulane University, where I also direct the Commitment to Equity Institute. And today's lecture will be on levels and trends on the evolution and the levels of income inequality in Latin America. And I will be sharing the screen in a moment where we have the PowerPoint that will be the subject of today's lecture. And I hope everything is working. We tested it earlier. And I think it shows on the screen, correct? My PowerPoint?
Yes.
Excellent. So, all right. So then this lecture is going to be based on a paper entitled 75 Years of Measuring Income Inequality in Latin America. The paper is jointly with Facundo Alvaredo, François Bourguignon, Francisco Ferreira. And it's part of the project, like I said, the Latin American Caribbean Inequality Review, and it's already been accepted and it's forthcoming as a publication in the journal Oxford Open Economics. The good thing about Oxford Open Economics is that it's open source, as its name seems to imply, and therefore everybody has access free of charge. If anybody's going to be using the graphs and tables that will be shared here, please use this reference unless specified otherwise. So this paper has in its title the word measuring because in particular, we wanted to emphasize that when you look at the evolution and levels of income inequality in Latin America, there is a measuring challenge, which, by the way, is not solely in the case of Latin America. It happens all over the world, including in advanced countries in which there are discrepancies in the inequality measures that exist out there. So what are the key questions that we're going to be addressing today? The first one is we want to know how much income inequality is there in Latin America? How far back can we go with confidence? A key question is what happened to inequality, for example, in the aftermath of the debt crisis since the 1990s onward. And also, we're interested in learning whether there has been a particular pattern. Patterns are important because they help us understand what may be the drivers that affect what we observe on the data. So are there common drivers? We're not going to talk about the drivers today. We're just going to talk about the indicators and how they have evolved. And the indicator that we're going to be using today is the most commonly used indicator of inequality, which is the Gini coefficient. And as a reminder, the Gini coefficient is always between 0 and 1 or 0 and 100 if you use it in percent. And the closer it is to 1 or to 100%, it means that there is more inequality, in this case, income inequality. So to answer the first question, one would think that it would be pretty straightforward. However, there's often more than one estimate for the same country and the same year. And you have to be aware of that and learn how to discern among the variety of estimators that in a moment I will illustrate with an example. So once you find discrepancies, it's important to understand what the source of those discrepancies is. Uh, and then, one wants to know, well, is there one way to measure inequality unequivocally right? Or are there a set of inequality measures that we need to consider as correct? that you will not be able to end up with just one number. Maybe you get an average of the existing numbers that you think are correct, but you may want to say that they are between a certain range. It's very, very difficult to get to one inequality measure that you can be absolutely certain that it is absolutely correct. All right, so let me illustrate what the situation, what the challenge is with a graph that has data on the Gini coefficient for Mexico between 1950 and 2020. In fact, I think we have some, maybe 2021, but I think this one goes to 2020. So, 70 years of inequality for Mexico. And these are Gini coefficients from all the different sources that we were able to collect. I'll explain in a little bit what the data looks like in our sample. And as you can see, there is a lot of variety. So, when I ask you a question, well, what happened? What are the levels in inequality and what happened to inequality over time? Depending on the data point you come across, you may end up saying very different things. So I illustrated with these arrows. For example, if you used as the first data point the circle that is in 1950, which puts a Gini at around 53%, and then the 2020 Gini is the last one at the top, you would say, oh my God, inequality increased by a lot in Mexico, more than about 20 Gini points. On the other hand, if starting from the same point, you said, oh, I run into this Gini coefficient, which is the bottom circle in the 2020 vertical axis, and that gives a Gini coefficient of around 0.42 or 42%. And you would say, oh, inequality fell, and it fell by quite a few Gini points since 1950 up to 2020. If you had started with the second available point in the sort of, if you go as far back in time as you can, which is around, I think, 1954 or 1955, the bottom, and you use the Ginis that are at the bottom also around 2020, you would say inequality didn't change. The same thing, the green arrows tell you what you could conclude depending on the data that you ran across is inequality in the 1990s went up, and it went up by a lot during all this period, or inequality declined, depending on which starting point you use. So what do you do if you have this large discrepancy in terms of both levels and trends that depend so much on the data? And therefore, it's very important that you're careful on how you select the data to actually make points both about levels and trends. So how much inequality do we really know, is there in Latin America? Here we're going to talk about first inequality using all sources. So what is the all sources that we have compiled in this paper? It's a metadata set of summary statistics. We did not generate any of the Gini coefficients ourselves, and they're primarily based upon databases that produce their own estimates. They're mainly four for Latin America. And actually, there's also one new one that's LIST, but the most common ones are CEDLAC, which is based in Universidad de La Plata and is jointly with the World Bank. UN ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, that has been producing inequality and poverty statistics for many, many decades. With the World Bank PIP, which used to be called POFCAL previously, and LIST, Luxembourg Income Surveys, which is based in Luxembourg. That's one of the main sources. Then we also used something that we call an aggregator. That's the United Nations University Wider Institute based in Finland that has a world income inequality databases that collects, compiles Gini coefficients from many different sources. It makes some quality control, and it has probably the broadest coverage, both in terms of countries worldwide, not just Latin America, and also in terms of years. Another aggregator is WidWorld, that's based in the Paris School of Economics, and it's focused now on producing distributional national accounts. And in particularly, all the Latin American data comes from a paper that is cited right there in this aggregator. The data points that I showed you from Mexico and other countries also include additional historical series that we were able to collect from individual studies and sometimes from official statistics. We ended up with more than 5,000 Gini coefficients in our data sets. We tried to cover the 34 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, but Caribbean data is very scant. So I'm going to present today only what we have for Latin America. The only country in the Caribbean that we have data for is the Dominican Republic. The years that are covered, the oldest data is from the earliest one is 1948 for Guatemala. And then the most recent one in the paper that we're presenting is for 2021. We have for 12 countries data for 2021 that comes from household surveys, not interpolations. So here, I put what the earliest data points that exist are for Guatemala, Mexico, and Argentina. Some of them are based on census data, by the way, not household surveys, because remember, now we're talking about all sources, not just household surveys. So when you take all the data points that are available in the literature from all these sources that I mentioned a moment ago, the resulting range of inequality estimates is considerably large. It's narrow, so some countries in some periods of time, such in Argentina in the 1970s. By the way, Argentina is the only country for which we only have urban data, and in the 1970s was only for the greater Buenos Aires, the area of the capital and surrounding region, and in Costa Rica in the 1990s. For other countries and periods, the range can be huge. And for example, I'm just illustrating here with 3 cases. Brazil in 1960, the lowest Gini is 43, the highest is 70, depending on the source. For Chile in 2010, 2011, it ranges from 44 to 70. In Mexico, the range is even larger. And here I show you this on the graphs that we have in the paper. You can see for Brazil first, Chile now, and Mexico for 2017. So the first question is, what do you do when you have this amount of information? The first thing is to say, what are the sources of discrepancy? And we have classified the sources of discrepancy into 3 categories. Variety 1, probably the easiest one, is data sources. The easiest one in one respect, because then you have to decide which data source you want to use. But the data sources that were shown on the graphs are either income expenditure surveys or employment surveys. Then other data points are surveys combined with tax data. Other data points are surveys adjusted to national account, what is also called now distributional national accounts. And other data points come from census. That's pretty much the whole spectrum. And each data source can yield very, very dramatically different, as we'll see in a moment, levels of inequality. Variety 2 is that maybe even within the same data, the welfare indicator and unit of analysis may be different by choice of the data producer or the researcher. And as you remember, the welfare indicator can be either consumption or income. In Latin America, it's mainly income, but it can be per capita or equivalized and can include owners occupied housing, imputed rent, and consumption of own production or not included. Sometimes it's net of taxes and includes cash transfers. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not clear. So there's different welfare indicators, even if you work within the same database as household surveys. And in addition, when you use combined data, for example, tax data usually is individual incomes and for adults only. And obviously, only taxable income is included in tax data. So all the informal income is not included. So welfare indicator is important as a source of discrepancy. And then there's also something that happens both by pre-processing on the part of data providers or researchers is what do you do to treat the same data to deal with issues of missing incomes, unit non-response? Do you impute them? What kind of imputation method you use? Do you reweight, etc.? That can have effects that are not trivial in terms of the changes in estimated inequality levels. So the different data sources that we have here in our sample primarily include three household surveys. And the reason why people like to use household surveys is they're designed for purpose. They have a good coverage of the bulk of the distribution, including informal incomes. And very importantly, they have covariates. So when you want to analyze the causes of inequality, one thing that you need to have is access to the covariates that are part of the household that was interviewed, education levels of household members, uh, experience, gender, race and ethnicity, and so on, are very important factors in when you analyze the causes and determinants of inequality. A major problem with household surveys is that they have poor and perhaps worsening, we have some evidence that it may be worsening, coverage of the top of the distribution. In other words, the rich are not included in household surveys. And for example, there's evidence, somebody in a paper by Sekeli and Hilgert, they said, okay, let's look at what the income is of the 10 richest households in a bunch of Latin American countries. And they found that it was roughly equal to the average wage of a manager in a medium to large size firms, or even less. And those are, good incomes, but they're not incomes of the billionaires and millionaires that exist in Latin America. They're not included in the surveys. And in particular, what happens is that income from capital is not captured by household surveys. The other source is administrative data, and that is either tax records or Social Security registries. That has a much better coverage of the top of the distribution, particularly tax records. Of course, not a complete coverage because at the top there may be tax evasion and tax illusion. It has very large numbers of observations, so it's robust in terms of obtaining estimates. But like I said, there's evasion and avoidance. Taxes have individual incomes as opposed to households, and usually you cannot reconstruct households unless you make from tax data, unless you make a series of assumptions, because you don't know, you don't have identifiers that allow you to combine different tax returns into a household. And of course, as already mentioned, tax data excludes not only what's non-taxable by law, but also tax evasion, in particular, the large informal incomes that characterize our region. The other source is that using national accounts aggregates and combining them with the surveys to map the aggregates in national accounts onto the households, and that's what's called distribution of national accounts. Uh, the national accounts are more comprehensive, usually because they include items as undistributed profits, which can be an important source of potential income, particularly of the wealthy. But the problem is that there are enormous discrepancies between what the presumably same variable in household surveys and even in tax data are measuring and what you measure in national account. National accounts, for example, it's not unusual to see for Latin America that household income is about 50% in the surveys from what you found in national accounts. So you have a gap that you don't know if the error is in the household survey, if it is in the national accounts, or in both. Probably it is in both, but at this point, we're not able to discern the extent to which is attributable to what source. All right, so the first source of discrepancy, as I said, is the type of data. So this is the same graph that I showed you earlier on Mexico that has data that comes from household survey. I circled it with a green, whatever this is a circle drawn by hand, a semicircle, starting in the 1990, because before we have data that comes from surveys, census, etc. So I focused on this period. So the group of circles that you see inside the green semicircle is household survey based, and the top is either fiscal, the first line, and the second is distribution of national accounts. So it's household surveys combined with external data to correct what you obtain from household surveys. The corrected Ginies are within the red circle. Okay, so that's the first source. You already know that you shouldn't be comparing the data points that are within the green with the data points that are within the red if you want to look at trends, because it'd be completely different sources, apples and oranges. Therefore, you would not be obtaining an accurate pattern if you looked at those data sources. When you are comparing within a year, you want to compare those levels, but be very aware that what has happened to the data, and we're going to come to that in a moment, that led to such a large discrepancy as observed here, depending on whether you situate yourself at the bottom of those points or those circles or at the top. Right? All right, so let's say now that we know that one of the main sources of discrepancy is the source of data, then let's look at what happens if we only focus on household surveys. For this, the household surveys, the household survey-based inequality measures come primarily, like I said, from the database by the United Nations Economic Commission of Latin America, UNED ECLAC, Socioeconomic Database for Latin America and the Caribbean, CEDLAC, which is this joint effort by the World Bank and the Universidad de La Plata. POFCALNet for before I think 2017, 2018, I forget when the PIP, the Poverty and Inequality Platform at the World Bank was launched. Earlier data comes from POFCALNet, and current data comes from PIP. And for a few countries, there is also data from the Luxembourg Income Study and OECD IDD. And the other sources, the aggregators, which in the case of Latin America, we use all the Gini's data set that is produced by Branko Milanovic in CUNY, and the World Income Inequality Database maintained by UNU Wider. So that's the spectrum. And this is what it looks like for the 18 countries in Latin America. Here I'm showing you graphs for the first 9. They're ordered by alphabetical order. Argentina, I want to emphasize always, it's only urban, the only country that has only urban. And the colored points are referring to the sources that are producing their own estimates based on microdata, as CEDLAC, ECLAC, POFCalMet, and LIS. The dark gray are from other studies, and the light gray, which are hard to discern here, not only the light gray are using other definitions of income. For example, the light gray may refer just to earnings and not to total income in the households, only what people obtain from labor market earnings. This is the continuation of the same graph for the remaining nine countries. And again, the data points that are in color refer to the 4 sources that estimate their own Gini coefficients based on microdata. So immediately you begin to see something that is here I'm zooming in some countries. Immediately you begin to see that, yeah, the range is high if you include all sources, but it begins to narrow. It doesn't disappear, but it begins to narrow when you look at the data sources that are in color, which are the ones that estimate their own Gini coefficients from microdata. And this is true for, here I'm showing you Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, that you immediately see the same pattern in which all data points show a range, and then that narrows, which is in a way good news. So what lies behind these ranges? We didn't go into each one of them. It would require very, if you want, dedicated, detailed, granular analysis to examine what lies behind. But there are all these options that could be explaining why you have these differences, given that they're presumably, in many of the cases, they're using the same data for the same country in the same year. So it could be the definition of the welfare indicator is different. Like I said, household income can be net or gross. There's, like we say here, remarkable opaqueness sometimes whether the collection is before or after taxes and transfers. Then could it be just the variable, the welfare indicator is total monetary income without including the imputed values or the other concepts? Is it adjusted or not for spatial price differences? Is it per household, per capita, or equivalized? For some countries, very few in Latin America, you can also have estimates or consumption expenditures for some years. And like I said, individual labor earnings, that doesn't include other sources of income. The other source that could lie behind this discrepancy is what I mentioned earlier, the different treatment of the same sample. And there's a bunch of things that researchers and data providers do that one should be aware of, because they do affect significantly what may happen with inequality. So based on household surveys, we conclude that there's 2 types of bands that we can identify. One is the full annual range of the data across all estimates that use household surveys or employment surveys. And band 2, which is the annual range of estimates across the 4 harmonized series. We call them harmonized because within each one of these data producers, there are CEPAL, CEDLAC, PIP, and LIS, or CEPAL if you use the English acronym is ECLAC. They try to harmonize what they produce over time and across countries, not necessarily among the data providers, but within. And for those, the range, like we anticipated, is reduced significantly. But no, it doesn't disappear. If you look just as the average, the band one averages is 7.3 Gini points for all the years and all the countries. The band two, when you just look at these four data sources, is 1.9 Gini points. However, look at Guatemala. Guatemala, even if you just focus on the four data producers that harmonize data, they show a significant difference in terms of what each one finds. It's 6 Gini points in maximum range, right? And the same, Venezuela also shows a range that is not insignificant. Chile does too. And so you still have problems in terms of differences, discrepancies, even if you just try to examine levels using the four harmonized databases. So what happens when we incorporate other sources in terms of income inequality that use either surveys combined with tax data or surveys combined with tax data and national accounts? Discrepancies increase by a lot. We already mentioned the pluses and minuses of the national the tax data national account aggregate. So let me move to the results. And for the results, we're relying on a paper by De Rosa, Flores, and Morgan that is available since 2022. That are the estimates that actually WIT World, the Paris School of Economics-based inequality database that produces distribution national accounts, uses as a source. This is the paper. And they were able to do this analysis, both in terms of levels and trends, for only 10 of the countries, because for those are the ones that the tax data that is available is also reliable. And remember that these are estimates that produce the results using a household survey by itself. That's the lowest, the blue line. Then they make corrections using the household surveys combined with tax data. That is the light green one in the middle of the lines that we see on the graphs. And then they do another correction in which they allocate all the income that is captured, all the income and government expenditures, etc. Everything is allocated that is in the national accounts. Everything is allocated to household surveys, including undistributed profits. So that's the green, the dark green line on the graphs that we're showing. And as you can see, there is a significant level effect. We'll come back then what happens to trends. So what does it do to the estimates when you incorporate these discrepancies? We show here in this graph a comparison. Band 2, remember, was the discrepancies that arise from using the four data sources that use harmonized methods. And for these 10 countries, Band 2 average discrepancies are 1.7 Gini points, so they're relatively narrow. When you incorporate the tax data and you compare the measures that use tax data with the ones that don't, that just use household surveys, and then the others use household surveys corrected with fiscal data, the range of the discrepancy on average rises to 10.4. And when you also continue correcting by adding to households, allocating all the national account totals that are captured in those data, then the range of the Gini on average can be 16.9 Gini points, so huge. And the graph shows you, the first bar that has the black diagonals is the 4 harmonized databases. The blue is the range between those harmonized databases and the sorry, not that, between the calculations by De Rosa et al. For from household service only and household service corrected with tax data. That's the blue, the range for each one. And then the yellow includes the range from household survey to corrections, not only with tax data, but also allocating all the national account items to households. So what does it mean allocating all the national account items to households? For example, they allocate government spending on education and health and defense and other public goods are allocated to households using different methods, different assumptions, sorry, which are explained in the DINA project. If you go to the WID World website, you would be able to download a document that explains the methodology used to get to this yellow levels. And this yellow is capturing what happens in the top line here on average for the country averaging for all the years. And the blue one is capturing the difference. So it's capturing the difference between the green and the blue, the dark green and the blue for all the years by country. And then the blue bar here is capturing on average the difference between the light green and the blue line for all the years in one country. So it's an average. It varies over time, the discrepancy, but it's already indicating the enormous difference that you can face in terms of deciding how much inequality is there in Latin America. So, because, if you say, okay, if I look at Argentina, which is urban, in 2020, I may say, okay, inequality is around 40 something Ginies, or inequality can be 60 Gini if you use the corrected with national accounts. 20 Gini points is a huge, huge difference. Okay, now let me just introduce here something regarding the use of corrected data. We know, as I said earlier, that household surveys are not capturing the incomes of the wealthy well. And they're not capturing the incomes of the wealthy well, primarily because maybe they're not there, and they may not be there because they did not respond to the survey. They did not respond maybe because they refused or they were unreachable. Like sometimes, when they live in gated communities, the numerators in the surveys cannot really access rich households, so they may not be there. They're also not be there because samples are, by definition, a sample of the target population, and the rich are a small proportion. So in some years, maybe the survey could capture someone who's very rich, and that person may answer correctly. In other years, it may not end up in the sample. There's what is called sparsity. So that's the typical sampling error. So the rich may not be there because of that. But in addition is the fact that the rich may not be there because they're not responding to the survey. And if they respond, some of them may refuse to give the response to the question on how much income they earn. So there's first non-response of the entire household or non-response of income, or even if they respond, they may underreport their income. So all these are present, and there is evidence that this is primarily a problem of household surveys globally, not just in the context of Latin America. And there's been a lot of work trying to sort of deal with this issue in household surveys through a number of correction approaches. And one of the correction approaches was used to produce the data by De Rosa et al. That I showed you earlier. The main difficulty is that there are lots of different approaches. In fact, right now in another paper that we're working on, we found that there are 22 different approaches that have been applied in practice to correct household surveys, and there's no optimal correction ex ante. There are diagnostics you could do to decide what's the best correction, which most of the people don't do in their work. So the corrected data that's out there is has to be taken with a lot of caution, including the ones that I shared today. And let me show you just a table here that illustrates the different correction methods in sort of an analytical framework. And the highlighted in yellow indicates that this is the one that De Rosa et al. Used. So they used one type of correction method, but they could have used many of the others, and the others were not tested. So we don't know the robustness of the results, given that, as I'll show you in a moment, using the same data, the correction method can produce very different results. In other words, if you use one particular correction method, you may get one result. If you use another one, you may get another result. And the discrepancies here are also very important. So this part of the lecture here is to sort of introduce a word of caution on using just one estimate, like we did in our paper, but we actually say that we have to be cautious because we only show one estimate for the corrected data, while we showed many data points for the uncorrected household survey based on that is important to bear in mind. So here, this is another paper, different one, in which we try to sort of see the sensitivity of inequality estimates to the correction method. And we did it for Latin America using the same data that De Rosa et al. Used in their paper. In fact, De Rosa is a co-author of this paper, and it's not out there, it's forthcoming. But I want you to look at the following. So I have 5 countries here with different survey years, but it's always the same data. That's what's important to bear in mind. The third column shows the Gini before correcting the household survey for every one of the countries. So this is what we find in the data that we were using. And then we show 3 different correction methods. One is using the household survey and taxes, and it's called the replacing method, in which you change what happens at the top of the distribution by an estimated function parametric model based on tax data. So you take out the survey top incomes and you replace them by a model estimated top income, upper tail. The other method uses survey and taxes and just reweights. Household survey, remember, has weights because the weights are the ones that expand a sample to the universe, to the population. And the third method uses the survey and the same reweighting methods as the one that I show immediately before, plus replacing with rescaling the incomes at the top using tax data. I don't have time to go into the methodological differences. I will share a working paper soon in which you will be able to look at them if you're interested. This is a paper that we're writing with Andrea Vigorito, and stay tuned. But I do want to show you several important things here based on the results of this paper. First of all, for all the countries, the corrected Gini is very sensitive to correction method. So if you look across Brazil, for example, the uncorrected Gini is 58.2, and the corrected one can range from 57.8 to 69.1. So depending on the correction method, on the same data for the same year, you can have very different results. By the way, in these cases, we're using also the same external data for correction. It's just the method that's different. The tax data is also the same. And one of the things that we find is that if you use this method is also very sensitive to the threshold that defines the upper tail that has problems. Is it the top 10%, which is the P90? Is it top 5%, the P95, or is it the top 1%? So already you see that depending on the threshold with the same method and the same data, but depending on where you say the problem starts, you can have a range that's not trivial, which in the case of Brazil goes from 57.8 to 60. The other important thing to note is that corrected Ginis are not necessarily always higher than the uncorrected ones. And the ones that are highlighted in gray here are lower than the uncorrected Gini. So correction methods can not always result in higher inequality. So these are the three things that I wanted to show you. And I wanted to show you this because the results that use tax data and national accounts in our paper are just from one method. And why are they just from one method? Well, I mean, that's the method the authors chose, but that's why we're also writing this other paper, because we want to show how the trends, how the levels at least could vary depending on the method used. So coming back to the question that we want to answer, which is how much income inequality is there in Latin America? I have to say here, I diverged from my co-authors because they were reluctant about giving a number, and they wanted always to show bands of, ranges of estimates. But I decided that, well, I mean, we need to give some answer. So what I did is I took the average of the Gini coefficients of the data bases that are harmonized, the 4 databases that are harmonized, and this is what we obtain. And I grouped them here into what could be considered high inequality, moderate inequality, and relatively low inequality. Relatively, I emphasize because 0.4 or 40% Gini now the World Bank uses to identify which countries are experiencing high inequality. So everybody in Latin America will fall under that category. But within Latin America, we have these 3 groups. And this PowerPoint is available, so you can go back to looking at them whenever you want to. The this inequality levels in Latin America, if you use these household survey based, puts Latin America, as everybody knows, at the high end of inequality globally. The purple one here are inequality Gini coefficients for Latin American countries. and the rest in gray are other countries in the world. So Latin America is among the highest, as you can see. Now recall also that I have shown only the inequality levels based on household surveys and based on the four data producers that harmonize the household surveys, and this is the average. But recall always that if you start correcting, the ranges increase. And using one of the correction methods, which is this one, just one, this is the outcome of the results in terms of ranges. If you use other correction methods, you may get different results, like I showed you here. For Brazil, you could even, if you had chosen the survey plus tax replacing method and a threshold of P90, meaning your upper tail problems are in the top 10% of the income distribution, you could have even concluded that inequality, even after correction, is lower in Brazil than it is with the uncorrected. So bear in mind that when you're making statements using this data, has to be accompanied by the caveat that it's based on one correction method. Okay, so inequality levels for Latin America are particularly challenging. Now, I can tell you that we have some good news, is that in terms of trends, we can say things with more confidence probably than when we talk about levels. I had said at the beginning that we had four key questions. The second one is how far back can we go with confidence? And our conclusion is that, the period of between the 1950s and 1970s, data is too scarce. It's also pretty idiosyncratic to discern patterns, especially when you're looking at many countries at the same time. If you are looking at a particular country and you do very careful analysis in which you look at other sources of data, that could be wage data, what happened to rural terms of trade, rural urban terms of trade, etc., you may come to conclusions using a series of other indicators that could reinforce what you found using the scattered data that exists for the 1950s and 70s. So also we have to be aware that prior to the 1990s, the household surveys that existed, several of the countries covered only urban areas. Nonetheless, we do find a pattern, and we find something very interesting, which is an inverted U pattern in terms of what happens during the 1980s and 90s, in which inequality tended to increase, and what happens in the 2000s and the early part of the 2010s up to 2015, in which inequality declined. The specific time at which this inverted U pattern occurs varies by country, but it is pretty common. For the countries for which we have data, we could find this pattern on a recurrent basis. So inequality today, we can say that is lower than the early 1990s. Means that in the aftermath of the debt crisis and the lost decade, first inequality rose, but then it declined, and it declined to such an extent that it's lower than it was in the early 1990s. And that result as a pattern is found pretty much regardless of the source. So that's what makes it more robust. Starting in 2015, more or less, up to the most recent data point, which is 2021, there's no pattern in terms of all countries together. There's countries in which inequality remain the same. In some it increased, and at some it declined. And like I said, these patterns are robust across sources, and thus the bands. So this is looking at just the household survey database. You can see the inverted U pattern for Brazil, increasing. I mean, inverted U is not a perfect U, but increased in the after and during the debt crisis in the 1990s, and then it declined in the yeah, I mean, it started declining in 1990s and the 2000s, and then you start beginning to have an oscillatory pattern. In Chile also you had an increase in inequality in this period and then a decline. And the same thing in Mexico, it increased in the period in the 80s and early 90s, and then you experience a decline, and then sort of stagnant evolution of inequality starting in 2015, more or less. This pattern, in terms of what happens to countries when you use household surveys and corrected the household surveys with tax data and also corrected with national account totals to produce distributional national accounts, which are the three lines that I showed you earlier, are pretty much sustained in the sense that what you observed in household surveys over time is replicated when you correct it with tax data and when you correct it even further by allocating national account totals to households. Meaning that when it increased in the three. When it declined in the three, with a very important exception, which is Mexico. So Mexico introduces a significant challenge here in terms of whether we can say, has inequality declined in the 2000s as we observed in the household surveys, or has it pretty much remains the same? If you use corrected data, you would not find a decline. So in Mexico, there's a question mark of what happened to inequality over time. The inverted U may disappear if you use corrected data. But remember, this corrected data used only one approach in the case of households income tax data, and the distribution of national accounts are influence significantly what happens to this. So maybe if we calculate the trends using other methods, the results would not be like the ones you observe here. So let me stop here and let's see whether we can have questions. I don't know if there are questions from the students here, from my co-conspirator in this course, Professor Feoli, and I don't know whether we want to leave this for the webinar, or do we now close the webinar and just do it and not record it?
We just would like to remind everyone that you can send us your questions using the Q&A or the chat. And also, if you raise your hand, we can activate your mic so that you can state your question if you have one.
So we don't have questions yet. I don't know if Ludovico, do you have any questions?
No, it is quite interesting to see the range along which these figures array themselves. And also that with the exception of Mexico, it seems that even within that broad variation, the good thing is that even within that span, the different forms of measuring seem to be suggesting the same thing, right?
Yeah, that's very reassuring. And I can tell you that unfortunately, we're doing this paper now at the global level. We do not necessarily find that in global data in other parts of the world, but in Latin America, we found that. Yeah.
And I think that for our students, it bears emphasizing the point you made towards the end that when you're quoting figures about where inequality has been and is going, it's very important to be conscious, to be aware of the source, the methods that were employed, especially if the data is corrected for whatever uh, for whatever reason it is corrected. It's really important to be aware of what lies behind those figures.
Right, which unfortunately there is a tendency not to do that. Uh, you know, people look for data, and if it's produced by a particular data producer, then it's fine, or a particular author, without a question. I mean, and it's natural because it requires a lot of time and knowledge to be able to do the questioning. But the first thing is to be sure that at least you use the source that has tried to harmonize
Yeah.
their series, even if they're not perfect. The data producer was aware about the issues. The second thing that concerns me in particular, and that's why we're writing this very comprehensive survey on approaches, methodological approaches to correct for what we call the missing rich in household surveys, is that people begin to use correction methods mechanically, depending on whether there's software available, depending on who says that they're using it. And that is also very dangerous, as we saw the results are ultra sensitive to the method approach that is used. I think that
Um,
there is a question on the.
yeah, we have a question from Sebastián de Souza, and I'll read it. Can you offer any insight into how policymakers can account for these discrepancies when writing welfare, other economic policies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very important question, uh, because uh, let me illustrate with another debate that is happening in the US. In the US, there's a huge discussion that has been going on now for several years, in which Thomas Piketty from Paris School of Economics and Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman wrote a paper on inequality in the US based on tax data, by the way. This issue of discrepancies occurs also even if you use a different source, not just household surveys. And a couple of authors, one is in the census and the other one is in the treasury, have questioned what they do, because the first authors found that inequality since the 1960s in the US had risen substantially. And the second set of authors found that it's been stable. So, and this is post-tax inequality, okay? And that is very important because there's this whole discussion about whether the rich are paying their fair share in taxes or not. And if the second ones are right, then apparently they are, because at least inequality didn't go up. Maybe you would like it to go down. But for the first set of authors, there's been a free ride for the wealthy in the US because they're not paying their fair share of taxes. So that's, one very important area in which what happens to inequality that affects policy decisions is fiscal policy, tax policy in particular, transfers, Social Security. And when, what would be my advice to governments is, well, first, look at the different trends and different trends all also using different correction methods and see whether the results are robust. Is there glaring discrepancies that apparently you need to understand them, try to understand them. I mean, there's been a lot written in terms of what happened to why is it that Piketty et al. And the other authors reach these very different results in the US. The same thing can happen for other countries. And then, there has to be a decision, which is the measure that you consider to be the one that's most useful for you to make a decision about fiscal, apologies, fiscal policy. I don't know if you were thinking of other sources, other policies when you asked me that question.
We have a second question that says, although the extremely wealthy are left out of household surveys, is the data of the extremely poor displaced persons included?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question too. Household surveys have problems both at the top and the bottom. The fact that you may have a lack of coverage of the very poor if they live in remote rural areas, for example, is a concern, or if they live in areas that cannot be accessed because of violence, that is a concern. So you may have underrepresentation of the poor in household surveys. Also, even if they are included in the survey, the misreporting by the poor is also important. Uh, they may be overestimating, underestimating, so the poor is very hard to determine the amount of income that they receive, given that it comes from different sources and it's not systematic usually. It can be high in one month and then very low in another month if you're in rural areas because of seasonality. So that is a problem, but it's a problem that affects primarily the measuring poverty, not so much inequality. Inequality is not so sensitive to what happens at the bottom. It does get affected, but what does get affected tremendously is poverty. So that's why, in all the work that looks at inequality, the concern is primarily with the problems in the upper tail, and in work that looks at poverty, the concern is primarily with the lower tail.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, I asked Sebastian if he had any follow-up question. I mean, besides fiscal redistribution, which other policies did you have in mind, when you asked the question, if you had other policies? So if there are no other questions, let me mention another factor that we did not discuss today, but it needs to be answered. Is well, since we found that except for Mexico, results in terms of patterns seem to be robust. This inverted U, it's pretty pervasive, and like Ludovico re-emphasized, that's good news and for researchers, because then we have at least something that seems to be robust independently of the data that you use. Then the next question is, what drives this result? So to what extent, you're having a reversal to the mean, that you had increasing inequality as part of the shock that it was the debt crisis in the 1980s and the market-oriented reforms, and now you're going back to what was sort of the normal trend. Or to what extent you also have factors that occurred throughout Latin America. For example, in our work, we have emphasized the importance of expansion of education as a factor that lies uh, behind the decline in wage premium for the skilled workers, and how that is a pervasive factor, perhaps, of explaining the decline in inequality in the region in the period in which it declined. And then you may have the idiosyncratic factors that are country dependent completely. Like in some countries, you tend to have recurring crisis and high inflation, like Argentina. In others, you may have natural disasters, etc., that could affect inequality specifically in that particular country. So a very interesting question for researchers now is to take these patterns. In our paper, we hint, there's a section that hints at the different factors that could be behind these patterns, but it's sort of an open question to do a systematic analysis. To what extent, like I said, is reversal to the mean, structural changes that are somewhat there to stay, or idiosyncratic factors that are country specific. So in the students, do you have any more questions? Ludovico, do you have any other things you would
No,
like?
I think this has been very clear and very enlightening. Just we can take advantage of the opportunity to remind everyone that we'll be meeting again Thursday. I think everyone knows the drill now with the webinar registration. It seems to have worked well. No, I'll leave the last word for you.
Right. I mean, we're assuming it worked well, but we didn't ask if everything was okay in terms of sound and and
It was on my end.
the screen. I presume that if we don't hear any negative comments, it means that everything went fine. And well, I'll be posting the PowerPoint in the session on Canvas momentarily, and also the paper is there if you want to look at the final version of the paper, which hopefully you would have read before the class. And for next class, the session will be on, today was on income inequality, the next session will be on wealth inequality. And with one of the authors of the paper that we used today for the corrected data, Professor Mauricio de Rosa from Universidad de la República in Uruguay, and his final paper, his and author's paper, final version is also on Canvas. I uploaded it because it was available already, and will also be published eventually in Oxford Open Economics. Without anything else to say, I think we can adjourn.